So welcome everybody. We are going to talk about the Renaissance. And as I warned you about this last week, this actually happens to be one of my favorite topics. So this is not going to be a one lecture topic, but a 2 or 3 lecture topic. So we will see how far we go. So today, basically, we are not yet going to talk too much about Renaissance in Britain, but especially about what Humanism and Renaissance are, and what are their roots. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm absolutely not going to mention anything British. So sometimes I do mention it a bit, but that's not the main focus of this presentation. The main focus of this presentation is to make sure that you actually have a general overview, you know the concepts, you have the necessary framework, and that you will then be able to apply this to the rest of the works and authors that we talk about. Okay, so let's talk about some of the basic concepts first. And well, the first thing that we have to mention is where Renaissance and Humanism originate, and that is not Britain. So, you know, obviously, a country which used to be probably the biggest in the world at some point in the past, with all the colonies all over the world, Britain is usually considered the country of all. Well, yes, but it doesn't mean they invented everything. So this, of course, originated in northern Italy, and more specifically in Florence, in the 14th century. But when I mean originated, it doesn't mean that it was only in the 14th century and then after that it was all over. In fact, it lasted longer than that in Italy as well. And especially if we consider how the Renaissance and its ideas, its artistic style, its influence spread in Europe, obviously this happened with some delay. There was no internet in the 14th century, and even the kind of postal service that I at least experienced in my childhood didn't really exist at that point. So obviously, while there was international travel, it took quite a lot of time until it got even to Britain. Which is not that surprising, because if you remember, even during the first lesson, we emphasized that even the Iron Age got to Britain with a delay, because islands are islands, and they are somewhat separated from everything else. Well, anyway, so to put it in some context, in Italy, the Renaissance lasted for something around 250, 260 years. And then, actually, more or less, by the time the Renaissance got, was already getting through its peak, was when, in Italy, was when it sort of started in Britain. So in Britain, we are talking actually about the late 15th, early 16th centuries especially. Well, not just early, but anyway. A thing that we have to mention here, Florence. Why do I mention a city? Why don't I just say Italy? Any guesses? And again, you know, you can say anything you want. If it's bad, if it's wrong, who cares? We are here to learn, so fire away whatever occurs to you. Why do I talk about specific city? Well, yeah, sure, but you know, if you think about it, usually if we talk about a style originating somewhere, we usually talk about states, countries, and we wouldn't necessarily identify it with a specific city. So how come that we actually do here? Or do I even talk about a city when I say Florence? Or do I talk about something else, slightly? Okay. No guesses? Nobody? Nobody studies maybe history or was good at history at high school?
Was it because the Medici and the other wealthy?
The Medicis are going to be very important, for sure. And the other wealthy merchants and bankers are definitely going to be important. But there is something else we have to talk about. And very briefly, the Roman Empire. We talked about the Romans, you know, who invaded Britain, then they left not because of Britain, but because they had trouble at home. Trouble at home was in which century? The 5th. That's when they left. In the 5th century, the Roman Empire actually sort of fell apart. The main reason were the Goths. Not the music fans, but, you know, the barbarian Goths. And what happened was that the Roman Empire actually had a different fate in the East and in the West. So the eastern part of the former Roman Empire actually survived the attacks, and for hundreds of years after that, it was still there. But what happened in the western part of the Roman Empire is it actually fell apart into smaller states. And some of those smaller states were relatively big, but Italy itself, where it all started from, that actually fell apart into city-states. Or policies, if you want. So city-states. And that's the reason, like Florence, when I say Florence, I don't just mean the town. But the town and whatever else the Florentians were able to keep under their control. And the same thing would be, Venice would be another state, Rome would be another state of its own, the Vatican would be a state, etc., etc. Well, in fact, Rome wouldn't be a state at that point. Probably the Vatican would be a state then. So anyway, this is why Florence is mentioned so specifically, but because of all Italian city-states, that was where it started from. And this is why we actually have to mention, because yes, it did appear in the other parts of Italy as well, but progressively, not at the same time. Now, the Renaissance as a period is strongly linked to the philosophy of humanism, and in fact is the result of the philosophy of humanism. So we cannot actually talk about the Renaissance without talking about humanism as well. So let's first talk about humanism, and then we will return to the Renaissance. It is usually said that Francesco Petrarca is the founder of humanism. Yes, it is usually said, but obviously that would be a bit of an exaggeration and a bit of an oversimplification. It didn't work like one day Petrarca woke up and said, let's start humanism. And then people just said, yeah, that's a good idea. So obviously not, but he was one of the most important, probably, well, not one of them, but the most important thinker of humanism. And he had a huge influence on the thinking of the period and of periods following. So that is why he is usually mentioned as the founder. So what do we know about this? Now, these three things are probably the central ideas of humanism. And I'm not actually going to start by the first one. In fact, I'm not even going to start by any of them, but let's first return to the Middle Ages, because this is very important. If you remember what you read in the book about the Middle Ages, then you probably remember there that it was explained that in the Middle Ages, in Europe, the central ideology was dictated by the church, so Christianity. And the kind of church thinking in the Middle Ages was that all humans are sinners. And the reason for this has to go, we have to understand this, we have to go back to the story of Adam and Eve. Who are those guys? Adam and Eve, have you heard about them? I'm sure you have. So, can somebody say briefly who are those? Biblical figures for sure. That's a very good answer. Anytime I ask about, prophets or Adam and Eve or Moses, it's a good answer to say biblical figures. But what specific biblical figures they are? What is their story? Yes, good. So,
the God, or I'm not sure how it goes, but I think God told them, like, you can have anything in the garden but the apple tree, like the fruit from the apple. I think there was a snake, not sure his name, and he kind of told one of them that they should eat the apple. They ate it.
And
they've been banned from the garden.
yes, so your version, I'm not sure, is that you actually perfectly know the whole story from the beginning to the end. Yes, this is the story we were looking for. And just one key piece of information that we have to mention, which was missing, is that Adam and Eve are the first human beings, of the first of mankind. According to the biblical story, they are our forefather and foremother. And this is what is important. Yes, of course, by the way, apple is a funny feature because it's nowhere written anywhere in the Bible that it's an apple, but the folk etymological version or the folk version of this is that it's an apple. All the Bible says is a fruit. And but yes, typically people think it's an apple. And the snake is Lucifer, actually. And basically, he is trying to tempt mankind to revolt against God. And because God says, you can have everything, the whole world is yours, just don't do that one thing, they still do it, so yes, they are, because of this, punished. And what is important is that from the perspective of Christian dogma, well, actually Catholic dogma these days, but in the Renaissance there is not much else, we inherited this sin. So, because they are not just any human beings, but our own forefathers, the representatives of humankind as such, everybody inherits this sin of actually eating of the apple. This is the sort of original sin. And this is why we all are sinners as mankind, because we revolted against humanity. By the way, we will probably return to this story in a few weeks when we are going to talk about restoration literature and Milton and Paradise Lost. But for the time being, what you should remember from this, and the reason I'm talking about this, is that in the medieval understanding of human existence, we are all bloody sinners who actually are punished by our life. The reason life is so difficult, so painful, so ugly, so much suffering is because this is what we deserve because of our original sin. So basically the best thing would be if it was over fast. The faster we die, the better. But, careful, actually, suicide is a mortal sin. So you are not supposed to kill yourself. So you have to die fast without killing yourself. Now, fortunately, it's the Middle Ages. So we have the plague, we have all kinds of other problems, so people tended to die fast anyway. But the overwhelming idea is that if you are a good Christian and behave well and believe, etc., etc., you will be rewarded. You will have a wonderful time, but only after you died. So, we are all looking forward to the great afterlife in heaven after death. And actually, this is what humanism has to say about this. Humanism says no. Humans are not bad, they are not evil, they are not people who are punished. Careful, the Renaissance thinkers and the humanists are not atheists. They are believers. They actually take this directly from the Bible. In the Bible, in the same part even, before the story of the Garden of Eden, we actually can read that God created mankind to his own image. Now, God, in Christian doctrine, is perfect in all ways. He's omniscient, meaning he knows everything. He's omnipotent, he's able to do everything. And he's omnipresent, he's all over. And he has no faults and is perfect. Now, obviously, if we are just an image of him, no image is ever completely perfect. So we are not perfect, but still, he created us to be like him as much as it is possible without actually becoming a God. That means that if God is good, and Christians say God is good, then humans must be good as well. So why all this fixation about on our sins? Another thing that is related to that, now this is coming from an ancient Greek thinker, Protagoras, but it actually fits also well with this biblical theory. Of course, for medieval people, we were all imperfect and sinners and horrible because for them, the measure of everything was God. And God is perfection itself. If you compare yourself to perfection, it doesn't matter how good you are, you're going to be horrible. So don't do that. It's not good for your well-being. Don't compare yourself to something or somebody who's too good. So they said, no, we are human beings. We have to measure ourselves to other human beings. So we can say, are we as good as somebody who is really a model, like a saint or like a big philosopher or something, but not to God. That's a lost battle. Also, an important thing, humanists say, okay, now, wait a second, we are talking about these kind of things, like what we are like, are we good, are we perfect, how we are related to God. These are extremely complicated things. That means, of course, that we have huge intellectual and creative capacities. We are amazing. Now, if we are like this is because God created us to be like this. So not using our mind to its full, not using our creative capacities to its full, would be a waste of God's gift. So our duty, it's not just a possibility, it is our duty to use all that we have to be the best version of ourselves. Okay, now, so, another thing we have to mention, now that we understand what humanism is that the Renaissance has a name for a reason. Renaissance, or in the original French version, Renaissance. By the way, don't you find it strange? It's an Italian movement and it has a French name. It obviously has an Italian version as well, but anyway, the name again comes later. So it's a retrospective naming. But, so Renaissance means what? Rebirth, exactly. And what is reborn here is ancient Greek and Roman culture. So what this period does is that it returns to Greek and Roman philosophers, Greek and Roman poets and historians and mathematicians and physicists and all that, and they again read their writings. Why again? Why do they have to return to the Roman stuff? Where did they disappear? They are in Italy. So why on earth do they have to return to their own Roman stuff? Well, because of the medieval church again. The medieval church considered, and I'm oversimplifying this extremely. I'm really happy that Dr. Podzimek is not here. I'm extremely oversimplifying this for your sake. But let's imagine, it's not 100% true, but let's imagine that the medieval church basically banned ancient Greek and Roman writings. And the reason for this is because those texts are full of pagan crap, which is against the doctrines of Christianity, against the only truth. So reading those pagan writers would actually lead you astray and would actually poison your soul, and you would never go to heaven. Now the reason I'm saying, just to save my reputation, the reason I'm saying this is an oversimplification is because, of course, there were certain important church fathers / philosophers / theologists who have tried for hundreds of years, even before the Renaissance, to actually make ancient Greek philosophy compatible with the teaching of the church. Most notably, but not only, Saint Augustine, who was actually trying to take the writings of Plato especially and make them compatible with the teachings of the church. But in any case, in the Middle Ages, even if, let's say, certain things are not explicitly banned, one thing is for sure. How many people could read and write in the Middle Ages? Any guesses? Not many, exactly. Not many. Perfect answer. And who could? What professions typically? Read and write, yeah. Well, obviously those who created the manuscripts. And what were those? What were their profession when they were not writing the illustrated manuscripts? They were in monasteries, yes. And in monasteries, you have, of course, members of religious orders, the majority of whom are priests. So either you were in an order, but in an order you don't necessarily have to be a priest, although the majority of them are, but you can actually be a lay brother, a brother who, or a sister if we are talking about a female order, who actually would be a member of the order, would keep all the rules, but would not actually be a priest themselves. So anyway, but the majority of them would be. And those who would not be monks, but would be actual lay priests, so priests who, are just in a church, they would, of course, also learn to read and write, and learn languages, and learn theology, and learn philosophy, and all that. So the majority of them were actually members of the church one way or another. Any other possible parts of society who could read and write? Not all of them, but some of them. Exactly, monarchs and other aristocrats. Very good point. And that's why I said not all of them, but most of them. And then, of course, there always were some people who were very talented at a young age, and while they eventually didn't join either priesthood or a religious order, but did get an education and then turned into, well, some kind of scribes or secretaries for aristocrats or for, merchants, etc. Merchants also typically used to not only be able to count, but also read and write, because they needed to keep a register of what they sold and bought. Anyway, so another reason, in the Middle Ages, you would probably not know the ancient text so well, was that since you were taught by priests, they would especially want you to read the Bible and read texts, religious texts, commentaries of the Bible and theological texts and these kind of things, and not anything else. So it is a big change compared to that in the Renaissance, they again start reading the ancient Greek and Roman texts, and they not just start reading them, but they start considering these texts as their models, rather than the Bible and religious texts. The reason for this is simple. They found out when they read these texts that the knowledge the Greeks and Romans had about architecture, physics, mathematics, and medical science were much, much more advanced than what they still remember themselves. So they found out, wow, if I want to build a really good house, then I should read these books. If I want to be really good at curing people, I should read these books, etc., etc. So basically, they just realized that they knew more. So the reason they idolize them is not because they have anything with the church, but simply because, well, they knew more. Now, they also, of course, realize, because they read the ancient sources, is that the human being is especially and primarily a being of the mind and the senses. The medieval version was different. The medieval version is that we were a being of the soul, and our soul, unfortunately, was entrapped our body until we die. So it sort of made things more difficult to do. But this, I would really, really like to emphasize, none of this means atheism. The absolute majority, if not all, of Renaissance writers, thinkers, architects, painters were themselves religious. Or at least pretended that they were in some cases. The reason for this is simple. If you remember, in the Middle Ages, do you remember those buildings that we looked at? The majority of those were churches. And of course, as we will soon find out, the Renaissance is very important also because this is going to be the first period where, besides the aristocracy and the church, there will be other sources of money. There will be other rich people. So that's good. In the Renaissance, you don't necessarily have to work for the church. But you still can, and they are still rich, and they can still give you a lot of money, so you might still end up actually building churches or painting holy paintings and all those things. So, that's why I'm saying either you were not an atheist, or you pretended you were not one because you could actually lose customers. And, okay. There is also this concept of the Renaissance man. Like these days, of course, we would call it the Renaissance human being. That is a bit sexist this way, but imagine that man here doesn't refer to male person. So the idea of the Renaissance person is that it is somebody who has wide general education and an overview of all kinds of things that it is possible to know and do. So basically, because they were really inspired by the Greeks, and of course the Greeks were similar in this way. If you think about what did the Greeks know about physics, you wouldn't find in Greek physics books, because they didn't write books of physics. They wrote books of philosophy. And in that book of philosophy, they were talking about all kinds of things. Music, poetry, art. So that's probably one of the reasons. But anyway, this idea would be that you have a really general education, and not only that, but you would actually have a balance between knowledge, art, and exercise. So the Renaissance ideal was that you would be very well educated in many, many different things, in fact, as many as possible, and also good at art. So not like me, that I know some things about art and I can talk about it, but that actually you would be either a good painter or a good sculptor or a good musician or something, besides being well educated. And another reason I cannot be a Renaissance man, you would actually have to have a really sexy body. Because you can only have a sound mind in a sound body, you know. And of course, if you think about Renaissance statues, David, you know, you would actually see beautiful bodies and not bodies. Okay, so now comes the question. How is it even possible that things have changed so extremely radically? How can we are all sinners, we should die as fast as possible, blah, 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 could we get to this other extreme? Well, if I wanted to give you the sarcastic answer, which of course I won't, but then we will actually talk about the real answer as well. If you actually read literary history or art history, you will find out that always from one movement to the other, there will always be an extreme opposite. Because it's very easy for those who write those histories to show you how things change if they do contrast. So actually, to some extent, it is a fake. You know, like there is actually even a very famous book written by the guy called Huizinga, who actually, and the title of the book is The Waning of the Middle Ages, which actually shows that it is only a creation of art historians that, you know, the Renaissance and the Middle Ages are so much different, that it's a contrast. And the whole book is about how things in the Middle Ages have changed under hundreds and hundreds of years, and the Renaissance is actually a natural result of the Middle Ages. But we don't have as much time as to actually talk about all the little details of those hundreds of years, so we will just pretend that it's a big contrast. But anyway, so now leave sarcasm aside, and let's talk about some of the reasons. I'm not actually going to talk about all the reasons that led to this change, but I'm going to mention 4 of them. And so what are those that I chose to talk about? Well, first of all, only because this is the first thing I put on the slide. It doesn't mean it's the first one in chronological order. It doesn't mean it's the most important or the least important. We will just start with this. Is that actually, although there were lots and lots of illnesses in the Middle Ages and after, before the Renaissance started, the biggest plagues actually happened. And You would ask, okay, but why is that important? Well, it is important because the plague was in some ways similar to COVID-19, in that it was everywhere, and everybody was talking about it, and everybody was very afraid of it. Or not everybody, but many people were very afraid of it, and they would actually wear masks, not these kind of masks, but these funny masks that look like a beak of a bird, and they would close themselves and all that. Yes, those are the similarities. What is not similar is that if you catch COVID-19, you have a relatively high chance of surviving. You also have some chance of dying, but still, more people survive than die. Whereas if you got the plague, you almost certainly died. Maybe not because it was a worse illness, but because they had much worse doctors, we don't know, and they even didn't know what caused it. So maybe these days the plague would not be so bad. But at that time, if you caught it, you almost certainly died. There were very few people who survived. And you didn't just die, you actually died painfully over a long period of time. So, wonderful. But what is interesting is that, first of all, this changed people's outlook on life. If there is no plague, and there are illnesses, but nothing is extremely horrible, and they are always there, then it's easy to say, oh yes, we have to work hard, there is not enough food, and life is difficult. But when you can die any moment, then suddenly life is something you have to enjoy until you can. So this sort of changed the mindset, not of everybody, but a lot of people just said, maybe life is not perfect, but hey, I just have this one life, so let's enjoy the moment until we can. And there is another thing. The ownership of wealth. If a lot of people die, there will be just a few people compared to how many there were before. That means, even in the Middle Ages, that people who are related to you inherit what you had. So if a lot of people die and only just a few survive, then all the wealth of the world is going to be actually in the hands of fewer and fewer people. So first, people rethink the value of life, and second, fewer people will have more wealth. Okay, another thing. The Fourth Crusade. What are the Crusades? I'm not asking about the fourth one yet, just tell me about Crusades in general. Have you heard about them? Křížová výprava. What were they for? In general.
It was, its purpose was to get rid of heredity.
Where?
Especially in the eastern part of.
No, actually no. The fourth one is misleading. That's why I'm checking if the correct information is there. So normally Crusades went to Jerusalem. That's the key point. Crusades were always supposed to be about Jerusalem. So yes, Christians were fighting against the Muslims, but not how this whole Muslim question appeared in 2015, when the Syrians were coming and many people were saying, oh, Muslim danger, they are going to, rape our women and all this crap. So not like that. They didn't care so much about Muslims as they did care about one thing, Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, of course, because of Jesus. So they said those Muslims cannot have Jerusalem. Jerusalem has to be on the hands of Christians. So if they kick them out from the Holy Land, not just Jerusalem, but basically the whole territory of the life of Jesus Christ, ideally, then they would be satisfied. The Muslims could be okay somewhere else, just not there. By the way, just Christians. They wouldn't want it to be on the hands of the Jews either. Although they would also have a lot of reasons to find this land holy. Actually, this whole Jerusalem issue is the reason it is such a big problem even these days is exactly because three major historical religions, the Jewish, the Christian, and the Muslims, are all considering it their holy land, and they all want to have it because of that. And this is what the first, second, and third Crusades are about. The fourth Crusade was supposed to be about this as well, but it went very, very wrong. And what happened is that actually on the way, they stopped in Constantinople and they decided, let's occupy this city. It would be so nice. The problem is, Constantinople is a Christian city. So the Fourth Crusade ended up the Christians attacking the Christians and completely ignoring this whole idea about saving the Holy Land. Now, why would the Christians attack the Christians? And the answer is, again, back with this thing that we mentioned at the beginning, that back in the 5th century, the Roman Empire fell apart, but not completely. The Eastern Roman Empire survived. And one more key element, the Eastern Romans, or let's go a bit back. Before the Goths come, there is the big Roman Empire. And by the time the Goths come, Christianity is no longer forbidden in the Roman Empire. Christianity in the Roman Empire is not even just tolerated. By the 5th century, Christianity is the official religion of the Roman Empire. So, when it fall apart, of course, if you now hear the word Pope, you mention which city? Where does the Pope happen to? In Vatican, which is actually inside Rome these days. In various periods of history, actually, the Vatican was like a relatively big country. But anyway, so the Pope in Rome, in his palace, is obviously convinced, all popes always, that they are actually the king of not just the Vatican, the physical land, but of Christianity as such. So they are the head of Christianity. Wonderful. But let's not forget that Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. And the emperor in Constantinople, in the Eastern Roman Empire, thinks this is our state religion. So who is the head? Me. So this is the problem. There are two people who both think that they and only they are the head of Christianity. The reason for this being, of course, is that the Pope originates his power from Saint Peter, who is they are all the descendants of Saint Peter, and Jesus actually told Saint Peter that you are going to be my representative on earth, and whatever you say is true, whatever you say is not true, blah, blah, blah. The problem is, both of these guys are convinced that they are the descendants of Saint Peter. So, the Crusade, who are just on their horses going to, attack the Holy Land, just happen to pass by another enemy, not so big, but it's on the way. So they just think, while we are on the way, let's fix this problem too. Well, they never actually get to the Holy Land, but what they do is that they actually conquer Constantinople and hold it for around 60 years. 60, 70. But more importantly, they also conquer a lot of Greece, and they actually keep a lot of Greece for much longer. Certain parts for 150, 200, etc. So, in Byzantium, as it is also called at that point, they obviously speak Latin still, and also they speak Greek. And in Greece, obviously, they speak Greek. So those people who are there have to actually learn Greek and Latin, and they actually are not all soldiers. There are also all kinds of administrators, and there actually are poets and artists and so on with them. Why? Well, A, because they wanted to go on the crusade, but B, because there was no CNN reporter in the period, so if you wanted people to write about you and make paintings about you, then you took the artists with you. So, while they are there, they discover a lot of Greek and Latin literature and culture, and they have actually access to the amazing libraries holding original Greek and Roman texts, or copies of the original Roman texts in Constantinople. So, that's another reason for the discovery, or rediscovery. Two more reasons I want to mention. One of them is the toleration of lending. Why do you have to tolerate lending? It sounds stupid. Well, the reason for this is the Christian concept of usury. Do you know the concept usury? Well, the Christian idea here is that it is okay to lend money to people, nothing wrong with that. If one of you asks another of you to give him or her some money, and you do that, there's nothing wrong about that from the Christian perspective. What is wrong from the Christian perspective is if you ask for any interest. Lending money at an interest, so for some more money to get back, like 5%, 2%, whatever, is usury. Not lending money at too high an interest, lending money at any interest. So making money on lending money is considered not just a sin, a mortal sin. The worst possible kind of sin. Now, then that actually probably explains to you why the Industrial Revolution didn't happen in the Middle Ages. Without capital, you are not going to start a company. And if you cannot borrow money, then you cannot then make money either. I mean, you need the starting capital. So, what changes in this period, in Florence, Venice, Naples, Pisa, etc., is that for the first time in the history of Italian Christendom at least, but also for the majority of Europe, for the first time, lending money at an interest is no longer a crime. It's still a mortal sin, but at least not a crime. So the church will still consider you a horrible sinner who goes to hell, but at least the government will not put you to prison. And you know, like, there are people who are willing to take the risk of going to hell if they can get rich on that. So that's a very, very big change. Actually, the Catholic Church would only consider lending money at an interest not a mortal sin much, much later. 18th, 19th centuries, something like that. But at least it is legal. Not only in these cities, actually, also in Switzerland and the free imperial city of Augsburg. So that actually explains why some Renaissance, some countries were faster in following the Italian cities in Renaissance than others. Basically, we've discussed already this lending issue in terms of why and where it happened. But why is it important? The reason it is important is that because the moment it was okay, at least in terms of legality, to lend money, you could make money. So that meant that banking families, Medici's included, and merchant families could actually make a lot of money on lending. And if they are rich, they can actually spend that on all kinds of things. Either to show off, so, they would be like, look, my palace is better than yours. They were not competing in cars because there were no cars, but there were palaces. And while they were, but not only, they didn't only make builders build palaces to show off, but because it was a good form of investment. If you built an amazing palace, then you could rent it out to somebody else and then actually make even more money on it. So, good idea. It's still the same these days. Another thing we have to mention is the invention of the printing press. Do you remember those poor monks with the illuminated manuscripts, spending months or years, or even more actually, on making one copy of a beautiful book? But by the time of the Renaissance, first of all, we have already learned from the Chinese how to make paper, which is a good thing to learn, because illuminated manuscripts were not written on paper, but on vellum, and vellum is actually leather, mostly of lamb. So poor little lambs had to be killed for the manuscripts. And now we don't have to kill anybody, we can make paper, first of all, but also they say Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. The more you read about it, the less convinced you're going to be about that, but he's conveniently the one who is attributed to have invented it. Why do I say that? Not that he didn't create a printing press, he did, but there were others very vaguely in the same period. So, why is that important? Well, one thing is that, of course, unlike the scribe, the printing press can actually make hundreds and thousands of copies of a page very fast and very cheap. So, books become affordable. But even more importantly, not only books, but they can make leaflets and pamphlets. If you actually read the records of printing presses, those were actually companies even then, so they had records of what they printed in how many copies, for whom, for how much money. You find out that the majority of what they printed were not books, but leaflets, pamphlets, posters, these kind of things. And this is actually very important. Now, still in the Renaissance, you shouldn't actually imagine that so many people were educated as these days in terms of reading. It's still not the period when everybody could write and read. The majority of people still couldn't read and write, but at least in rich cities, there were more and more people who were educated enough to be able to read and write. So it made sense, if you wanted to convince people about something, anything, to go to a printing press, order leaflets that you can actually pass out. So people on the streets were given free reading. So most of the reading was not books that they bought, but free reading that they got on the street. So it's another important thing, because through cheap books and free pamphlets, the ideas spread much faster. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Renaissance art. Now, after spending roughly an hour on talking about how Greek and Roman ideas actually influenced them, it's not going to surprise you that Renaissance art has Greek and Roman art as their models. Now, some of the other things that we can mention are things like realism. Renaissance art tries to be realistic art, but not necessarily the way that you would imagine realistic art in terms of, let's say, 19th century Charles Dickens type realistic art. Not that way. And I will, in a minute, show you examples, but before we go there, let's go through briefly of these things. Attention to details. Details are very important for the Renaissance artist, because the Renaissance artist doesn't imagine art like the 19th century artist. For the 19th century artist, art is being in a trance, being, magically touched by the muses and sort of doing something you cannot even explain, and it just happens, and wow. This is not how a Renaissance artist imagines his work. A Renaissance artist considers being a painter or a sculptor or an architect a job. He considers himself a craftsman. And basically, the more perfectly, in a more realistic, in a more detailed way, in a more like a real person or a real house or whatever the thing looks on or in the painting, the more convinced he is and everybody else that he is a good craftsman. So that's why attention to details. Linear perspective is important. Linear perspective actually means being able to represent the three-dimensional world in two-dimensional space in a way that it looks three-dimensional. Also, non-religious subject matter appears. Up to this point, almost all, or maybe all art was to some, not all, but most art was religious in subject matter. Not necessarily because people were more religious, but more like because the church had the money to pay for it. And now not only the church has the money, those rich bankers can pay for paintings about other things, especially themselves. That's where their favorite topic was paintings of themselves, of course. Because, and this is what the system of patronage means, that unless you were one of the biggest absolute top names, and not in Britain, but let's say top names in some Italian city-state, then you wouldn't be able to be a freelance painter or a freelance poet. Not at all. You wouldn't be, there would be too much competition and too little market. So the way it worked is that you tried to visit rich people, the church, or aristocrats, or rich merchants, or rich bankers, and convince them that I'm really good, look, these are my things, I brought them with me. Why don't you start sponsoring me from now on? And if they were lucky, they said, yes, we will. And then what it meant is that they got, some place to live, a studio, food, money, etc., etc. And the only thing they had to do in exchange for that is do what they wanted to do. Paint, or write poems, or whatever they were good at, or build houses. Okay, maybe they were also expected, not maybe, for sure, they were also expected to put in as many of their works as possible how amazing their sponsors are. So, that was part of the deal. But if you look at YouTube these days, it's not that much different. They have all those spots about their sponsors. So, it's the same thing. Anyway, so this is absolutely not a Renaissance painting. And this is why it is here. This is here not to be a Renaissance painting, because this way you will understand what is that big difference that I want to show you. Now, this is not a very realistic painting, right? I mean, realistic in the sense that you can see that there are people in it. But that's it. Like, for example, there is, of course, Virgin Mary and Jesus. Jesus looks 40 years old at least. If you take a look, it doesn't look like a baby. But anyway, what is absolutely not realistic is what are these people doing there? Like levitating, and why is it suddenly cut in half and then there are other people and, But that's exactly what medieval painting looked like. What they cared about was not realism, but message, content, symbolism. They wanted to show the Madonna with Jesus, with saints and angels, and with Jesus. And of course, Jesus is 3 times bigger than everybody else because he is Jesus. He must be 3 times bigger at least. There is only one person so important than he is. Also, look at the colors. This is not because they had no other colors and they ran out of green and all that, but all of these colors have symbolism. They mean something. And I'm not going to go into details, but blue, especially this particular type of blue, symbolizes cleanliness, virginity, innocence. So that's not a coincidence that Mary has that blue cape. Also, actually, if you were really good at the life of the saints, then you would be able to recognize every single saint in the picture. Not because we have photos of them, we don't, but because they have their attributes in their hands or somewhere else, so you would know what to look for. So this is pure symbolism, not much to care about reality. Now, if you look at this picture instead, and the reason I chose this picture is because, well, it also has Virgin Mary with Jesus, then you would actually have a different idea to some extent. Because that lady and that child, well, okay, not a baby anymore, it's more like a 5-year-old child, but anyway, so that child, that lady, those guys, if you met them on the street, you would recognize them by their facial expression. Main reason for this being that they probably actually had a model. So they really tried to paint somebody who was sitting there as a model. Now, so this is what I mean by realism. That actually they would paint pictures where what you would see, you would almost see as if in a photo, in terms of being able to easily recognize. But careful, the symbolism didn't disappear. Mary still wears the same colors, for a reason. The green would be important too, but not only that. Look at this guy. What is his profession? Now you probably won't know, but you could know if you were Catholics. Because this is not a cake, but this is the cap or hat of the Pope. It's a papal hat there. So we know it's a Pope. Another reason we know it's a Pope is because he wears white and gold. Those are the colors of a Pope. So we already know that this is a given Pope. And if we know the title, then you would know that that's actually Saint Sixtus. So it's not the Sixtus Chapel, why this is called the Sistine Madonna, but because of Saint Sixtus there, who happened to be a Pope. Because it's not in the Sistine Chapel at all, it is in Dresden. So if you want to take a look, get on the train, buy a ticket, go inside, see it. That gallery is full of Raphael and a lot of amazing, famous paintings. And it's extremely close, extremely cheap to get there. Great opportunity. Anyway, but not only the colors are still symbolic, they are still arranged in a triangle. These clouds, I mean, people don't walk on clouds, right? And not only that, but if you go and look up there, you see that the cloud actually turns into the souls of dead people. So, I mean, yes, realistic, but not kitchen sink realism for sure. Or this. Now, this picture is amazing because it shows you very well not only that they knew about linear perspective, but that they were extremely happy that they knew about linear perspective, because they just loved painting the interiors of churches or other impressive things that perspective allowed for them. Also, it again shows that realism for them didn't mean showing outside reality, but showing something that looked realistic. Because just look at this picture. What do you see there? Can you describe it to me? Well, again, we have, of course, the Virgin Mary with the child. Where? In a Gothic church. Because that's exactly what the Virgin Mary did, right? When in her life, there was no Gothic architecture even. So that's already weird. But even more importantly, what is this? A window. And there is a lady who is sitting next to her window, and the window doesn't open to the street, the window opens to the church. And this is not a nun. It's impossible. Her window opens to the church. And of course, it is not the case. She reads a book. The book is a prayer book. And while reading the prayer book, she, of course, has such a strong religious experience that she imagines that she is in church and this is her. She's even twice in the picture. And that she is in the church, and in the church with her is the Virgin Mary. So this is what Renaissance realism means for you. You know, realistic in some ways because it looks like an actual church. This church could exist. People look like people. But, by the way, if you say, well, these people don't look so photorealistic as Raphael's, you would be right, because this actually comes from the book The Hours of Mary of Burgundy. And this is from page 14. This is a tiny little hand-painted picture. It's just magnified. So in this size, it's relatively realistic, you know. Okay, another example how Renaissance realism is a completely different type of realism than what you hear when you hear realism. Is this realistic? Well, in some ways, yes. It's a realistic apple, or realistic cherries, realistic cucumber, realistic corn. but you wouldn't see a man looking on the street looking like this, right? It's impossible even. By the way, again, for seeing some paintings of Archimboldo, you don't have to go far, just to Vienna. So this guy had a lot of these paintings. This is summer, so the things that you see are supposed to be things that grow in the summer and illustrate the plenitude of summer, but he also has winter, he also has books, etc. So, all right. My last example of how Renaissance realism is something else. This is the Master of Frankfurt, and this is his self-portrait. What is on the head of the woman? Not the scarf, but up there. It's a fly. And the reason the fly is there is not because somebody took a photo badly, but because he painted it there, because he imagines like, oh, you're looking at the paint, and like, fly away, and then you realize that it is in the picture. So, they actually want to even sort of impress you. I'm so realistic that you believe that was an actual fly. Similarly, there is a neat trick here. This painting has two frames. This is frame one, but inside there is an actual frame as well. But the table here is brought so close to the frame that at first, if you don't pay close attention, you think this is the frame and not this. So it looks like the piece of bread is falling out of the picture. So, they are doing a bit of magic here and there. Yes. Okay, now you could already say this is all wonderful, but we are here in British studies, so show us something British. So there you go. The reason I didn't show too much British, first of all, because I wanted to show this kind of typical or interesting Renaissance realism, but also because, to be honest, there is not that much in British painting from the period that is really worth looking at. For the reason, not because British people were not interested in Renaissance paintings, but because most of those people in Britain who wanted paintings actually solved this problem by offering a lot of money from painters from elsewhere in the world to move to Britain. So most of the painters in the Renaissance period in Britain from the Netherlands, especially from the Netherlands, but actually also from Italy, etc. Most of the British painters in Britain were painters of miniatures. That was like a very, very fashionable thing in Britain in the period, having a tiny, tiny miniature portrait inside, for example, a little necklace where you could have the painting of your beloved lady or your beloved gentleman, etc. And actually Hilliard is a famous painter of miniatures, but this is not a miniature. This is a normal painting on wood panels, and this is one of Hilliard's portraits of Elizabeth I. He had several of them, and this one is called the Pelican Portrait. And I am not going to be that nasty to ask you why do you think this is a pelican portrait, because you would actually say there is no pelican in the picture, and you would be wrong, because there is a pelican in the picture. It is something that is actually on a necklace or something like that, hanging from her neck. There is another picture which is called the Phoenix portrait for similar reasons. So, yeah, whatever. So, I showed this to you so that you cannot say that I didn't show you a Renaissance painting painted by somebody British. There you go. It's a portrait. This is Elizabeth I. That's all there is to say about it. This is not bad, but nothing special. Okay, so let's move to architectures. We still have some time. Now, Renaissance architecture, again, not surprisingly, is based on ancient models, but this time not so much Greek and Roman, but really just Roman architecture. But this is not a big problem, because Roman architecture was completely based on Greek architecture, so Greek architecture is there just indirectly. It is not surprising that Roman architecture was the example, because the Renaissance started in Italy, so they were there. Those Roman buildings were there, and many of them are still there, so they didn't have to read about them in books, although they did. They could go there, take a look and say, we want to build something like this. Now, symmetry, proportion, geometry, these are very important words. In a way, Renaissance architecture is a very mathematical style. It is very much done in a way as if you were in a geometry lesson. Now, columns are still extremely important. If you remember, Gothic architecture and Romanesque style were also very much buildings full of columns. But here, columns get a completely different level. These guys are going to be obsessed with columns. So much so that they talk about different types of columns, and just certain types of columns are even allowed. The Gothic was happy to do all kinds of crazy columns. You can find churches where you would have twisted columns or columns that look broken. Nothing like that. Here there are 6 types and you have to choose from those. Okay, 5. You will see in a moment. But they were so extremely obsessed with columns that they also needed pilasters. Pilasters are things that look like columns, but are not columns. So, meaning either columns built into a wall or onto a wall for no reason whatsoever, but it looks good. Because obviously once you have a wall, it already keeps the things which is on it. You don't need an extra column inside the wall, but it looks good. Lintels. Do you remember the word lintel? The last time we talked about lintel, we were talking about what? Stonehenge. So the lintels are back. Which is not to say that there were no lintels before, but the Gothic was not very interested in lintels. They were interested in arches, primarily. So here, column, horizontal block is absolutely fine. Arches are no longer pointed. They are semicircular again. And the main reason, or one of the main reasons, we know that they care about Roman and not Greek architecture, is that we have huge domes in the Renaissance architecture, and there were no domes in surviving, at least, Greek buildings, or not too often, whereas the Romans loved it. Which is not surprising. For a dome, for this big spherical roof, you need a huge building. And the Greeks were tiny little city-states. They didn't need majestic, huge buildings. The Romans, however, the Roman Empire needed majestic, huge buildings because they themselves were a majestic, huge empire, and they wanted to drive that message home. Niches are tiny little window-like things inside the wall, which do not have an opening on the other side. And they also liked edicules or little buildings. Okay, so this is why I said 6, but I should have said 5, because here there is only 2 copies of the same. So anyway, and if you even find 5 too many, then that is because you thought of Greek columns. Because first of all, the Tuscan style doesn't sound very Greek at all, right? Of course, that's something invented by the Romans. So the Tuscan order was actually not a Greek order. Also, the Renaissance added an order of its own, a completely new one, the composite order. So the simplest is the Tuscan. It's just basically a very functional, simple column which is not decorated almost at all. It does still have a head part still. Then, the Doric, which was the original, the Tuscan was a simplified version of the Doric, is almost the same, but you have these stripes going along the column. The Ionic, you have those 2 snails on the top. The Corinthian, you don't have snails, you have leaves, even though this looks almost like snails here, but these are just twisted leaves. And then the composite would be combining the snails with the leaves, which is not a good idea. If you ever had a garden with salads, you know the snails will eat it. But anyway, they still combine it because these are columns and they don't eat them. So, these are the columns, and we still have 5 minutes. So, an example, St. Peter's in Vatican. It's a majestic, huge building, and as you can see, it was built for 120 years by various architects. There's a dome on the top. You have the columns, and here are pilasters. These are not columns at all, but they are there just for fun. Lintel, you wouldn't see anything like that in Gothic style. Some horizontal line, just like that. And anyway, the whole building is not spiky, but more horizontal. And let's take a look inside. It's actually the biggest Christian church in the world. Not the biggest church, but the biggest Christian church in the world. So, you know, you have a lot of light, more fake columns all around the place. Mosaics. It's another typical Roman thing. If you remember when we were talking about actual Roman architecture in Britain, we were talking about the mosaics. The dome from below. Yes, and now I'm already at British architecture, because fortunately, unlike with paintings, there were quite a lot of interesting Renaissance buildings that survived. And not only that, but there was even at least one major British Renaissance architect, and that's Inigo Jones. There were more British Renaissance architects, but if you want to remember one name, then remember Inigo Jones. So as you can see here, again, columns and pilasters, smaller windows than in the Gothic, but many, many more windows than in the Gothic, and not stained glass windows, because the Greeks and the Romans didn't have them, so they didn't really want to have them either. And this is the banqueting house, which was a part of what used to be a royal palace, but most of it didn't survive. And let's take a look inside. It's even more Roman antique in the inside, right? Simple lines, very geometric, very much full of straight lines. lots of columns, Renaissance painting on the ceiling. This here, possibly also an Inigo Jones building, here it's not 100% sure, is a church. This absolutely looks like an ancient pagan temple, as much as it is possible. But it isn't, it is a Christian church, but the Renaissance wanted to build churches even not in Rome, obviously, not in the Vatican. They wouldn't get away with that. But in Britain it was actually possible to make even Christian churches look as if they were Greek or Roman temples. And to show you not only an aristocratic building and a religious building, because the first one was a royal palace, so aristocratic building. The second one was a Christian building, so and this one is, well, a manor house or a minor castle, not castle, palace in the countryside. And as you can see again, very much lot of straight lines, lot of light, but in a completely different way, columns, etc. It's also beautiful. I mean, these are also impressive in their own way, but just impressive differently. Okay, now we are not going to discuss the sonnets in the remaining 2 minutes, so we will leave that to the next lesson. And thanks for being here. So I'm really, really, really looking forward to the next week.